All right, so today's lecture is on your skin and body membranes. So we're going to be talking about the integumentary system today, but we're also going to start with a discussion about some of the other types of body membranes that you find um, inside of you. So the first thing we want to talk about is the function of body membranes in general. So their job is to line or cover body surfaces, protect those surfaces, and then in some instances actually lubricate or provide moisture in the form of either saliva or in the form of mucus or in the form of oil, help to lubricate the body surfaces themselves. So we can classify our different body membranes really in kind of four different ways. There's three different epithelial tissue membranes. So remember, epithelium is classified based on the number of cell layers, simple or stratified, and the shape of the cells. Are they squashed, squamous? Are they cuboidal? Or are they columnar, which means they're taller than they are wide? So the epithelial membranes consist of the cutaneous membranes, which are the dry keratinized membranes. So that's like your skin. Okay. Mucous membranes, which are found in your, in your nasal cavity, but also your digestive tract and down into your respiratory system. And then you have serous membranes, and we'll talk about serous membranes throughout the course, but serous membranes are essentially the bags that all of your organs sit in, and those are surrounded, filled with serous fluid, and we'll get to those in a second. And then we have the connective tissue membranes, which make up your synovial joints, which are the joints that are the things between your bones. So let's talk about skin. So skin is a dry membrane, obviously. It's the outermost protective part of your body. It helps protect you from things like infection, and it helps you protect you from burns. It protects you from chemical damage, and all these things are super important. We'll get to those in a second. Mucous membranes, as I said, those line all body cavities, both inside of your body. So, and all of these things at some point open to the exterior surface. So whether it be your digestive tract or your respiratory tract, those internal membranes, even though they're inside of your body, are in contact with the outside environment. And a lot of times their purpose or their job is to either absorb or secrete things. So either to secrete things like mucus or absorb nutrients in the case of the digestive tract. And here's showing you those serous membranes I was mentioning. So a lot of your organs are actually sitting in bags that kind of keep them separate from all the other organs and also help to keep them moist. And as I said, kind of held in place where they're supposed to be. And the way a serous membrane actually looks, we'll see it on this next page, is it's basically a bag that has inside of it either air or water, or excuse me, either has, doesn't have air or water, that's what it says there. It has serous fluid in it. So it basically has fluid inside of here, which acts as a way of kind of keeping it moist, but also protects it and prevents friction and things like that. Okay, so classic examples of these are like peritoneum, which is found in the abdominal cavity in your stomach. It's basically the tissue that holds up and supports your digestive tract. Then there's a specialized one called the pleura of your lungs. In the pleura of your lungs are sitting in a bag, and actually it's actually part of the function relationship of your lungs. And if you've ever heard of like puncturing a lung, that means you've punctured the pleura usually. And it actually creates a vacuum that allows for the lungs to, when you distend your diaphragm or you move your diaphragm downwards when it contracts, when you breathe in, the pleura is what allows for that negative pressure and allows for you to be able to draw air inside of your lungs. If you don't have that capability, you're not going to be able to properly breathe, and you're not going to be able to get oxygen effectively in there. And you'll be able to breathe, but it'll be more labored, and that usually heals over time if you puncture your lungs. But as I said, the pleura is another example of serous membrane. And then the pericardium, which is around your heart. So your heart's actually sitting in a bag as well. All right, the only connective tissue membrane that we do talk about are synovial joints. So synovial joints are the joints that, as I said, are found between bones and inside of synovial joints. So essentially they're surrounded by connective tissue on all sides, dense connective tissue, hyaline cartilage, as you can see here, bone, as you can see here. But what's cool about these is inside of these joints is synovial fluid. And synovial fluid is essentially like oil. It's like a lubricant. So not only do you have that hyaline cartilage that prevents friction from your bones rubbing together, you also have the synovial fluid, which acts as a lubricant to help maintain smoothness when you're moving your hands and your legs and your toes and whatever other places where you would move around. And what's kind of cool is that there's nitrous oxide gas that is dissolved inside of the serous fluid, or excuse me, not the serous, the synovial fluid. Can you tell it's late? Synovial fluid, and that is what happens when you sometimes expand your synovial joint by pulling on your finger or something. It actually causes that gas to release, and that's what causes the, let's see if I can do it, see the popping noise? When you pop your fingers, that's simply synovial joints popping little gas bubbles. And is it dangerous? You know, a common thing, old wives' tale, that they say that, you know, cracking your knuckles is bad for you. It's not going to cause problems unless you're really wrenching on it, causing actual physical damage. So if you have a knuckle cracking habit, though it may be somewhat annoying to other people, it's probably not going to cause you too many problems. Unless, as I said, it gets to the point of where it actually causes damage to the underlying cartilage. All right, so now we're going to get into the integumentary system itself. So this is where we focus strictly on the skin and the derivatives of that are found within the skin, important other components such as sweat glands, oil glands, hair, because we are mammals, and then nails as well. So the purpose of your skin in general is to protect from, as I was kind of alluding to this earlier, but I didn't want to spoil it. It helps to protect you from a lot of different things. The first thing is mechanical damage. So if you didn't have such a thick layer of skin and also the underlying tissues below the epithelium of the top layer of the skin, you could kind of easily damage yourself. You could easily damage those tissues because they'd be very thin. But because we have a fairly thick layer of skin here, and then we have other tissues below it, it helps to prevent from mechanical damage. Like doing something like this doesn't really hurt my hands or my arms. And that's because of some of the cushioning that we have there. Also, if you like scratch yourself, right, it doesn't go straight through and you don't start to bleed because you have several layers of tissue above your blood vessels. It helps keep you protected. It prevents chemical damage. So if you do get like acid or something on your hands, you usually have a certain amount of time before you can actually, it causes damage to your skin. You can wash it off. If you ever have a cut on your finger though, and let's say you probably experienced this, you're probably not playing with like hydrochloric acid, hopefully you're not playing with that, but if you've eaten fruit or has citric acid or vinegar, and you get that in your finger, if you have a cut, that really burns, right? But if you just get it on your regular skin, it doesn't. That's because the skin provides protection from that chemical damage. It stops bacterial damage. It basically is an important part of your immune system, your first line of defense, to stop any bacteria or viruses from getting into your skin. It prevents thermal damage. And you probably burned your hand, and you have a natural reaction to withdraw your hand if something's really hot. If you withdraw your hand quick enough, you usually don't have much damage whatsoever at all. But you also could sometimes damage it a little bit more by, like, getting a second-degree burn from blistering, which we'll talk about. But still, it still protects those underlying tissues, and because this surface epithelium is so easy to heal, you may hurt yourself and damage that epithelial tissue, but you will heal from it. As opposed to if you really damage the underlying tissues and the nerve, it may not heal properly. It protects you from UV radiation, and it uses the release of certain pigments, which we'll talk about, called melanin, which gives your skin color and helps to give you a little bit of SPF from the sun. It's not much, but it does give you a little bit. And lastly, it helps you from stopping from drying out. Drying out, or desiccation, and that's one of the most important and most overlooked functions of the skin. Because if you are open to the environment, not only obviously would you be constantly attacked by probably bacteria because you're a giant, like, nutrient-rich soup on the inside, but also you would dry out and you would lose tons of water very, very quickly. So because your skin's waterproof, not only does it keep water from absorbing from the outside environment into your skin, it also stops water from escaping as well. So it's super important for preventing desiccation. So mechanical damage, chemical damage, bacterial damage, thermal damage, UV radiation damage, and stops you from drying out. Excuse me. Okay. Another cool thing that skin does, it also aids in heat regulation through the release of sweat. So the skin itself doesn't directly do that, but the sweat glands within the skin release sweat, which is mostly water, and through evaporative cooling actually helps to cool you down. On top of that too, I mean, us as mammals, we don't have tons of hair, but other mammals which have a lot of hair, hair actually, when you get cold, it causes it to stand up straight, and it actually creates a kind of a buffer of air, of warm air before, on top of your skin, between the top of the hair and your skin, and it helps to minimize heat loss. As I said, we have the remnants of that on our hair, right? But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into hair and goosebumps in a bit. And it also synthesizes vitamin D, and vitamin D is really important for proper bone health and things like that. But you synthesize vitamin D through sun exposure. So sun exposure, obviously too much of it is not a good thing because it increases mutations in your skin and can increase the risk of skin cancer. But getting sunlight every single day is actually very important, and that's one of the reasons that why, specifically in like Western New York or in the Northeast or in Canada, we tend to be deficient in vitamin D, especially during the winter, because we don't get enough sunlight. All right, so now we're going to talk about the structure of the skin itself. So the first two main layers, which are really the only ones to be considered the skin itself, are the epidermis, which is made up of stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. So you can see here, this is all really hard, dead, keratinized cells. And then the living cells are below that. So this would be like a more impervious, hard, waterproof layer. And by hard, I don't mean like really hard, like hard to, it's not like your nails hard. Those are the extreme of keratinized. But it is waterproof and it is tough. Whereas below that, you have some of the living layers of cells down here. And then finally, after you get past this layer, we move into the dense irregular connective tissue and loose connective tissue that is found in the dermis. So your epidermis is the top layer, and then the dermis is kind of this middle layer, and that's where a lot of the functional parts of the skin are actually located, which we're going to look at in a minute. And then below the dermis is what's called the hypodermis. And they don't actually consider it part of the skin, but it is mostly adipose tissue. And if you've ever seen, if you haven't even watched Grey's Anatomy or any of those shows, the hospital shows, when they do surgery, when they cut, sometimes you can see yellow when you're cutting through the skin. Once it gets to that point, that means you're actually into the hypodermis, and that's what anchors the skin to the underlying organ below it. If you've ever heard of the term subcutaneous fat, that is referring to the hypodermis specifically. All right, so let's go back to the epidermis, that top layer, which is made up, as I said, of stratified squamous epithelium. There's only a few layers that I really care that you really understand. It's the bottom layer, which is the one that is actively undergoing mitosis all the time. You've probably heard that your skin's constantly regenerated, right? You're losing skin off the surface of your body constantly, and that's what actually makes up most of the dust that is found in your house, is the skin that comes off of your body. But the stratum basale is what actually is doing the dividing, and what happens is, if you imagine, it's called another term for the basement membrane, the stratum basale, it's the bottom layer, and the cells will grow up, and as they grow up, and they basically are replacing the cells above it. Once cells get to the top, they will die, they will thicken and keratinize, and eventually will slough off, or they will fall off. And this process keeps happening, and the cells just keep moving up and up and up and up. So you're constantly regenerating your skin on the surface of you. Like, for example, the skin that I have now on the outside was probably not there a few months ago. So you kind of replace that constantly. Then there's a few other layers in between, and I'm not in this course really going to get into them. There's like the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidium, which is only found in skin like that you find like in the pads of your feet where you have really thick, I kind of never think of the term, calluses. Okay, but then there's the top layer. So this is the other one I want you to know. So I want you to know the bottom layer where you have active cell division, and then the top layer, which are the shingle-like dead cells called the stratum corneum. Think like corns on your feet if you want. Those are like really hard, right? And keratinized. Hopefully, well, you probably don't have corns because you're too young. But anyway, keratinized. These are keratinized cells. They've infused with a special protein, keratin, which waterproofs them and makes them tough. But it also, in the process, when they become keratinized, it kills them. So also found in the basement membrane are these things, these super cool cells called melanocytes. And melanocytes are what produces pigment, and actually that pigment helps to protect you a little bit from the sun's rays. Now, it is a common misconception that once you get tan in the summer that you are then protected substantially from the sun. That is not the case. You actually still will burn, and it still causes your cells to accumulate DNA damage. So there's never any excuse to not wear sunscreen, even if you have darker skin pigmentation or you've increased your melanin concentrations due to exposure to the sun previously. You still should always wear sunscreen to help protect your skin from damage. It'll not only if you're not wearing the proper sun protection, not only will it help to prevent skin cancer, which is super important, it also helps to minimize aging, right? So sun damage causes a lot of aging and rapid aging as well. So melanocytes can vary in color depending on your genetics, but there's some yellow to brown to black, and you have different versions of it depending on, as I said, your genetic background. So some people have just natural amounts of melanin in their skin, right? So they're kind of naturally have darker skin tones. But when you have sun exposure, it usually causes you to produce more of it. And that's a homeostatic mechanism. It's your body attempting to protect you from sun exposure. And they're really cool looking cells, actually. I'm going to go back. You can actually see them. They look like little amoebas, and what they do is they kind of reach in and they put pigment throughout the skin layer, darkening them, or darkening the skin. And it's said it's stimulated by UV damage to your cells. That stimulates melanocytes to produce melanin. Okay, the dermis actually is composed of two main layers. The first one is called the papillary layer, and you're going to see it. It actually is like these little projections. It projects out. It looks wavy. Okay, and within the papillary layer, you see capillary loops. So you'll see blood vessels go up into it. But you'll also have your pain receptors located within the papillary layer. So when you touch something and it hurts, that's activating receptors that are found in this papillary layer of the dermis. Below that is the reticular layer. And in the reticular layer, you'll have larger blood vessels, not just capillaries, which are really thin, small blood vessels, but larger ones. You'll have some of the sweat and the oil glands, and you'll also have nerve receptors for things like touch and pressure and things like that. Oops. So here's looking at the overall skin structure. As you can see at the top, the epidermis is really small compared to the dermis in terms of its thickness. The epidermis is like paper thin almost on your skin. And as I said, if you ever cut your skin, or you have a paper cut or something, if it bleeds, that means you've actually gotten into the dermis because you're starting to actually disrupt these blood vessels that you can see throughout here. when I was talking about the papillary layer of the dermis, you can see here this wavy part right here, wavy, wavy, wavy. This is the papillary layer of the dermis. So anywhere it's pink within there, and you can see there's a pain receptor right there, and you can see the capillary loops kind of going up into it. But below that, the reticular layer of the dermis, which is this larger area of it, has the hair shafts. It has other nerve endings for pressure and your sense of touch. It has the sweat glands, which look like these little squirrely, squiggly looking things. So in your notes, you want to make sure you label all of these things. So what I want you don't have to label all of it. Let me explain the things I want you to label. I want you to label the epidermis. So label your epidermis. I want you to label the dermis, which is this whole layer right up here, this pink colored layer. I want you to label the hypodermis, which you can see here, which is that fat layer below, which is not technically part of the skin itself. I want you to label eccrine sweat gland, which you can see right at the bottom here, eccrine sweat gland, which is this little squiggly guy, and you can see it actually empties out to a pore on the skin right up there. So far, epidermis, dermis, hypodermis, and eccrine sweat gland. I want you then to label the hair follicle, which is this part right here. This is the follicle of the hair. You can actually see this if you pull a hair out. Sometimes the follicle comes out with it. I want you to label, let's see, the sebaceous glands, which empty out onto the hair. You can see they look like cauliflower kind of. It's this guy right here, but also this one. Okay, so label your eccrine sweat, or excuse me, your sebaceous glands. We already labeled the eccrine sweat gland, which is that guy. Label capillaries, which are these guys, these things that come up here, the red and the blue parts. Those are thin blood vessels. And then I want you to label the erector pili muscle right here, or the hair erector muscle, it's sometimes called. And those are super cool because they help. That's what pulls on the hair. You get a goosebump and causes you to have goosebumps, but it pulls the hair and stands it up straight. So when you're cold, as I said, I mentioned this earlier, it's an evolutionary relic because in us, our hair standing up straight doesn't help keep us warm. But in other mammals that have lots of hair, it actually does help to provide a layer of protection, of warmth between the external environment and the internal environment. And also, when you think of another time when you get goosebumps is when you're scared. So in other mammals, when they're scared, they want to appear more fierce. So they get goosebumps, and you'll ever see if a dog is upset, its hair stands up on the back of its neck. That's the same process. That because it's scared, it wants to look more fierce. Super interesting stuff. So you should have labeled the epidermis, the dermis, the hypodermis, the eccrine sweat gland, the hair follicle. Actually label the hair shaft too. That's the one thing I didn't have you label yet. Hair shaft. You could label the dermal papillae, the papillary layer, which is this layer right here, the projections that go up. Label the sebaceous gland, the reticular layer, which is everything below that papillary layer. So the papillary layer, as I said, is very thin. Everything below that's reticular. The erector pili muscle. And I don't really care about you knowing the different types of nerve endings. I'm not going to worry about that. Okay, so hopefully you have that all labeled. So what actually determines your skin color? So we talked about melanin already, right? The yellow, brown, and black pigments. But that's not the only thing that gives your skin color. Like what gives it, sometimes it's light, it's more reddish appearance. Sometimes even the food you eat can affect the color of your skin. So beta carotene, which is found in orange vegetables, carrots mostly. If you eat enough carrots, it'll actually turn your skin orange. And because it starts to implement those pigments from what you eat into your skin itself, which the most common one is carotene that we see affecting skin color. So if you know anyone who really loves eating carrots, you'll notice that the palms of their hands probably look a little bit more orange than yours. Hemoglobin also helps to affect the color of your skin. Obviously, some people have things like rosacea, where when they're embarrassed, or when they even when they're not embarrassed, it causes their face to become very red and flushed, right? And you can tell the difference in your skin. Like if your hands are really cold, sometimes your hands appear like almost like a blue color, because the blood pools away from them. They're not as red and rosy as they normally look. And the oxygen content of it actually determines the extent of the red coloring, with more oxygenated blood being a more bright red color, and deoxygenated blood being a more darker color. Not blue, but a darker color, more rust colored. So what you can see here are sebaceous glands. So sebaceous glands are these special oil-producing glands found on the hairs, and it empties out onto the hair. It is a lubricant for the skin, and it aids in waterproofing. It kills bacteria, so it's super important. As I said, most actually empty onto hair follicles, which is why if you don't wash your hair for a while, it becomes greasy, because the sebaceous glands empty onto them. And these are not activated until puberty. So like my kids, they don't have really active sebaceous glands. They don't produce much oil. But when you hit puberty, changes in hormone levels triggers your sebaceous glands to release oil. And that's what can cause, along with other things like acne and clogged pores, which can trap bacteria in pores, which eventually causes some of the issues associated with acne. But as you get older, usually hormone levels regulate, and you end up not having acne as bad anymore. Sweat glands, there's two main types. There's eccrine and apocrine. Eccrine are your standard sweat glands. Those are active in children and adults. That's what helps to cool your skin. Okay, and sweat is basically just salt, water, and a little bit of urea, which is the waste product. But then there's the apocrine sweat glands, and they're really cool. Those tend to empty onto hair follicles, and they're only found in like your armpits and your groin. And the purpose of those types of sweat glands is really to produce a more milkier sweat. It has antimicrobial properties, but it also has scent associated with it. So here you can see here's showing you eccrine, the water being released from it, sweat cooling on the skin. And as I said, most sweat is just water and some waste, like urea. But in apocrine, you do have the fatty acids and proteins that are produced as well. Now, most of the time, sweat actually inhibits bacterial growth. But if you don't wash for a while, bacteria eventually take over, and body odor occurs. And body odor is actually as gross as you can imagine it. It's basically bacteria just pooping all over your skin. It's a bunch of the waste products they release and what that smells like. That's what body odor is. And depending on the normal bacteria that exist on your body, you get different types of body odor and different smells. Isn't that fun? I think I'm going to stop it right there. So before we get into hair, so I just wanted to get you introduced into the integumentary system, specifically while everyone else in class, when they're in class, is doing the lab on tissues. So that's your brief introduction to the integumentary system. As I said, if you have any questions, please let me know.